Hello, and welcome to our session on Forget ROI, How's Your ROSI? I recall in my first job that I ought to be very careful here not to divulge too much of my age here, that when EVA or economic value added was launched in the mid-1990s, that it was the be-all and end-all metric for economic returns. These days, you don't really hear much about it in the area of finance. In impact investing or return on sustainability investment, ROSI in short, can help companies better understand returns on their sustainability investments and drive smarter decision making. While impact investing, in our view, is here to stay, how about ROSI? To answer this question and more, I would like to invite Tensi Whedon from NYU Stern School of Business to share insights on ROSI. And after a presentation, Shari will be moderating the Q&A session for her. Tensi, over to you.
Thank you so much. And I think we were also going to hear from Sharil first. Is that correct?
That's great.
Well, Tansi, it's actually your show. I'm here to support you after. I think the people have signed in to listen to you more than me this morning.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you both. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. I'm excited to have a conversation with you about the return on sustainability investment. So I am going to share my screen and hopefully this will work well. Yes, there we go. So as we heard, I'm going to talk a bit about the return on sustainability investment. And I'll start first with this study that we did at the New York University Stern School of Business, where I run the Center for Sustainable Business. I'm a professor there. We looked at more than 1,000 academic studies that were produced between 2000 or published between 2015 and 2020 that looked at the correlation between environmental, social, and governance performance or sustainability and financial performance. And what we found when we looked at this both at the corporate side and on the investor side is that 58% of the studies demonstrated a positive correlation between ESG and sustainability and corporate financial performance. Only about 8% of the studies found a negative correlation. On the investor side, we found that 33% of the studies found that ESG investing outperformed conventional investing. 26% of the studies found that ESG investing performed similarly to conventional investing. And then about 14% of the studies found a negative correlation. Also, just interestingly, we did a deep dive into studies on climate change to understand if there was any differences. And in particular, you can see on the investor front, 43% of the studies on climate change found that when you took climate into account in your investing strategy, you outperformed. Now, these studies are correlation, not causality. In other words, they're identifying a relationship, but we don't know why, right? And so when you look under the hood to try to understand what is driving these better performance metrics, we find that generally corporates are not actually tracking the return on their sustainability strategies. They're tracking their sustainability performance or ESG performance, and they're tracking their financial performance, but not how the two are connected. And also, when you think about the definitions of ESG and sustainability, environmental, social, and governance, which was really developed by the investment sector, does not include profitability in its definition, whereas sustainability really does. So it's a sort of an interesting conundrum here. And we're going to spend more time really looking at how do we get at understanding what is driving better financial performance when you embed sustainability core to your business strategy. First, we're going to look at the basics of ESG investing and just make sure that we're all on the same page with that. So as we look at ESG investing as a field, it really has evolved. Back in the 70s, 60s and 70s, and even beginning of the 80s, it was really what we call values-driven investing or socially responsible investing, where investors were solely focused pretty much on negative screens. In other words, keeping things that they didn't like out of their portfolios, such as guns or tobacco, things like that. But there wasn't much more to it than that. And as you know, in an investment strategy, when you reduce diversity within a portfolio, you can sometimes reduce performance. And much of the socially responsible investing did not perform all that well because it was primarily this negative screen approach, which again, totally fine. And that makes sense for people who want to invest that way. But it did leave a sort of background of people thinking, oh, this stuff does not perform well. Then over time, what we've seen in the last decade is a real shift to, while negative screens still exist, to proactive ESG investing, focusing on how companies are performing on ESG factors along with their financial performance. And this shift has been driven by a number of different things. One, that we're got more and more data that shows that this is actually a strategic and useful approach. More and more regulatory focus, as well as societal concerns associated with issues such as the impacts of climate change on business and society. Various crises, including most recently the pandemic, where we saw that during downturns, ESG investing actually performs better. So a variety of different influences on this. Just to make sure we're all on the same page when we talk about ESG, E is all the environmental issues throughout the life cycle of a company. S would be social issues such as worker well-being, community relations, product quality and safety, diversity and inclusion. And then good governance practices would include things like diversity on the board, transparency and reporting, ethical business practices, data privacy and security, and so on. Important to understand that there are different types of sustainable finance today, right? And Goldman Sachs, and I'll show you as well, and Morningstar, and everybody has a slightly different take on this, but I think this is a useful one to give you a sense of this. So on the ESG investing side, this is around understanding any type of company. It can be an oil and gas company. It can be a consumer products company. What is their performance on material, environmental, and social governance issues, those issues that are material to that particular sector. And then once you understand those issues, there are a variety of different strategies that a company, that an investor might use. They might just take that information into consideration, but not do much with it. They might decide to only invest in the top 20% of performers on ESG. They might decide to invest in the middle group, but those that have made commitments to ESG and sustainability, because in making those commitments, they might see better financial performance. So there's a series of different ways you might approach that ESG integration. And additionally, oftentimes those are combined with some negative screens. So you might say, I'm focusing on a comprehensive set of sectors, but I am not going to include fossil fuels, for example. On the impact investing side, this is focused on companies whose mission is to affect a social good, but they still are for-profit companies. So on the ESG investing side, as I said, that could be any type of company with a positive social mission or not so much. On the impact investing side, it would be things like inclusive finance or renewable energy or plant-based food products, right? Things that have a goal of improving a particular societal challenge or opportunity. Within impact investing, which you see in public markets, but more often private markets, you have two strategies, one which is market rate. So you're aiming to get the normal returns you would get, or concessionary, where you see family offices with high net wealth or foundation endowments say, I still want a return on my investments, but I'm willing to take a lower rate of return if you can demonstrate to me that there are significant environmental and or social benefits. So again, in impact investing, sometimes people confuse these two things and say, oh, well, you know, if you're going to do impact investing, you're going to lose money because you have to take a concessionary rate. But that is not necessarily the case. That is just one element of impact investing. When you look at Morningstar, which looks at and rates all types of funds, their framework also looks at this sort of improve the world, improve investments. Improve the world is more on the impact side of things. Improve investments is more on the ESG side of things. All of these, depending if you implement the strategy well, can perform well, right? Or they may not, because it's not that every manager, just like in any type of asset class, may not perform particularly well. Where we are currently, there's the Global Sustainable Investment Alliance that tracks investments globally, issues reports every 2 years. Unfortunately, as you can see here, the coverage of all regions of the world is limited. So there are only certain regions that they're covering. You can see pretty consistently growth. So from 30 trillion in 2018 globally to 35 trillion in 2020, again, with probably some markets undercounted. And you can also see where, for example, in the United States, we saw significant growth this past year. In Europe, we saw a dip. I think that comes from the fact that the Europeans have now put in place regulation that requires more, I would say, certainty and carefulness about what is being claimed to be ESG. Whereas in the United States, I think at the moment we have a bit of froth. In other words, some things that are being called ESG that are only nominally so. And we also are seeing our regulators begin to look at that as well. When we look at ESG performance in 2021, Morningstar is looking, and this is on the US level, US sustainability leaders outperforming by 8%. In 2022, there's a lot of discussion around how ESG is underperforming. And that's because, and let me just turn to this slide for a second. They, of course, as any investor knows, you don't ever invest just on the basis of 1 or 2 quarters, because there are always going to be problematic moments. So this is looking at 5-year performance, and you can see again that over the 5 years, including the first part of 2022, there continues to be outperformance. However, one of the primary reason why ESG investments are down in the first part of 2022 is because most ESG portfolios or funds are overweighted in tech and underweighted in fossil fuels. And fossil fuels have performed pretty poorly over the last 5 years until the last 6 months. And so now you've seen, a shift there for these funds. And tech has performed well and is still performing well, but has been down a bit along with the rest of the market. So that's one of the reasons why we see some shifts over these last 6 months. So looking at how ESG is manifesting itself across asset classes, just to give you a few examples, and then I'm going to focus in on the return on sustainability investment. But you can see there's many different types of activities in the whole sustainable finance arena, right? In debt, there's a variety of different types of debt that we're seeing issued associated with green or social or sustainability. I'll talk a little bit about that. In equity, of course, both at the public market level, private equity, we're seeing a lot of activity. There's also policy-based sustainable finance related to things like cap and trade. And then we're seeing the emergence of new opportunities, new investments, things like conservation finance, pay for success financing, where your financing is tied to your performance. Stock exchanges taking initiatives on sustainability. So a variety of different things happening in the space. Looking at debt. So there's a variety of different types of, let's call it sustainable fixed income. And the international, International Capital Markets Association has designed some principles around how you define these types of debt. And these debt can be corporate debt, it can be municipal debt, it can be national debt, a variety of different issuers. But there's different kinds, which is useful to understand. So there are green, social, and sustainability bonds, which are tied to the use of proceeds. And so they've set up a set of principles around what would qualify as sustainable or green or social, right? So, for example, would converting a coal generation, a utility to more clean coal rather than eliminating coal, be included in one of these bonds, right? So you need that kind of definition of what can be included. There are also sustainability linked bonds, and those are different. Those bonds are tied to ESG or sustainability metrics that the company puts forward and or the municipality, the issuer, and the financier will agree to reduce the interest rate if the ESG or sustainability metrics, KPIs, are met. But the proceeds themselves can be used on anything. They don't have to be used on sustainability. They can be used on any kind of investment the company wants to make. They just need to be able to demonstrate ESG performance along with the metrics that they jointly agreed upon. So this is a growing area, oops, as we can see in this next slide. The sustainable debt issuance has, more than doubled from 2020 to 2021. And you can see here those sustainability linked bonds and loans growing quite sizably. The biggest area currently and has been all along are green bonds. But again, you can see the diversity of issuances occurring. Moving on to public equity. So there's a variety of different ways that public equity investors are engaging with companies. One is through proxy voting and in direct engagement with companies. And we're seeing more and more proxy votes, contention about board members. You may or may not have seen that ExxonMobil was, there were a number of investors that got together to nominate board replacements that had actually climate credentials because the investors observed that Exxon was not actually dealing with the risks that they had in their business related to the carbon transition. So we're seeing those types of proxies get more and more votes, be more and more introduced. ESG integration, another, as we talked about, so public equity investors are incorporating ESG criteria and data into their analysis. Other companies are creating sustainable portfolios using those ESG ratings and negative screens. And then we have, as we mentioned before, investing in companies with an environmental or social mission or a thematic focus, such as renewables. So just to give you an example of one ESG fund that the Morningstar has given 5 stars to, the top rating. This is the Brown Sustainable Growth Fund. And what's interesting about this fund is they're not relying just sort of on ESG data. They have an investment thesis and they're focusing on a limited number of companies who they have identified as having internal sustainability strategies that generate tangible business benefits, products that have a competitive advantage as a result of sustainability drivers, and products or services that offer solutions to long-term sustainability challenges. And so I think with that investment thesis, as you can see, they've had really significant positive performance. And this also goes to that ROI point. This investor or asset manager is really seeing that there is an opportunity to get better returns through supporting companies that have embedded sustainability into their business strategy. Moving on to private equity. So again, private equity investors, 2 different ways that they can engage or they are engaging with their portfolio companies. One is once they've purchased a company, again, no matter what kind of company it is, they can engage with the company to improve its performance. So if you look at a very large mainstream private equity firm, KKR, out of the US, they are working with portfolio companies to reduce their energy use, greenhouse gas emissions, and saving money for the companies in doing that. They're also looking to create employee-owned stock plans, because they also see that as a way, when the employees are more engaged, they are more productive and driving more value. But those can be with any kinds of companies that they're bringing that kind of focus. And then they can also do direct investment, specifically in companies that have an environmental or social mission. So to give you an example, TPG, which is a very large mainstream private equity firm, has created this Climate Rise Fund, which has several $billions to focus on growth stage climate companies who are coming up with solutions in clean energy, decarbonized transport, regenerative agriculture, and so on. And just to give you an example of an investment, so I just think it's fun to see how this actually manifests. It's working with a company called a couple of companies, Monarch, a natural that runs anaerobic digestion to create renewable energy. They're also working with a natural gas producer, and Smithfield, which is a very large ham company, hog company. And the hog farms are generating a significant amount of methane emissions. So this joint venture that's being funded will collect those methane emissions, convert them into natural gas, and renewable natural gas, and sustainable fertilizer, while sequestering any excess carbon. So a net benefit, but also creating a clean energy proposition. There are some challenges around ESG, and there's a robust debate happening right now around on this topic. So just to mention a few of the challenges. First of all, there's challenges around the data. So it's all, for the most part, in most jurisdictions, voluntary. And so people are reporting on very different things. So you have apples and oranges, as we like to say. They're mostly not audited. And because they're voluntary, again, they'll choose different standards, different metrics, very hard to compare. In addition, there are multiple reporting standards, though we're seeing, the emergence of the International Sustainable Standards Board that is being set up by IFRS, that was announced at COP26 last fall. That standard is also working with the Sustainable Accounting, Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, SASB, and the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosure, will be working with those two standards to incorporate them into the ISSB. So when that standard's out there in a couple of years, it'll probably be, while I don't think SASB and TCFD are going away, there will be a more robust global standard. Also, the data rating agencies use use different data, weight the data differently, have different approaches. Some will talk to companies, some won't. So you see one company, and I'll show you some examples of this, being rated very differently by different agencies. Then we also see that reporting standards, and I'll come back to this for a minute later, are focused on process, not performance, right? So SASB metrics, for example, in the apparel sector, a material issue is chemical management. So the SASB metric is, do you have in place a robust chemical management policy? But nothing about, because it's a reporting standard and you can't really benchmark, nothing about what you're actually doing. So another apparel company that might have put in place a bio-based dye that reduces chemical waste, reduces energy use and water use, and provides competitive advantage when you aim to sell it to a brand, is treated the same as a company that has a broad chemical management policy by the standards. So really important to understand the limits of these standards. For the asset managers as well, they're not terribly transparent many times about what their ESG investing strategy is. So it's not always clear what they're looking for. The investors themselves don't have a lot of ESG expertise. I'm actually getting thousands of people into my executive education courses because they need more experience on ESG. There is greenwashing happening, and there's market and regulatory volatility around ESG investing, as you know, as we're seeing most recently. So just to show you what I meant about these ESG ratings, this study was back in 2014, but more recent ones show the same kind of chaos. So you can see here, looking at the same companies, but evaluated by two different data rating agencies, there's absolutely no correlation between them. And if you look, for example, at specific companies, you can see here Tesla, who, as you know, was most recently dropped from the S&P rating. This was, I think, 2 years ago that this particular study was done, 2 or 3. You can see that the rating agencies have very different opinions about Tesla, with FTSE giving them very low ratings, MSCI, for the most part, giving them high ratings, Sustainalytics in the middle. If you look down at General Motors at the bottom, you can see they're all over the place. Exxon tends to be they're kind of grouped in the same. But so what makes the differences amongst these? Well, again, we don't really know, because the rating agencies, this is their IP, so they don't share in a lot of detail how they're coming up with these things. But if you think about Tesla, on the environmental side, where you see 3 different ways of approaching this, you could be thinking about the negative impact of the lithium, et cetera, going into their batteries. You could be thinking about the fact that for the most part, the electric grids that the cars are being charged on are not currently renewable. You could be thinking about those types of issues, or you could be thinking about the fact that Tesla is, changing the entire dynamic and really moving forward with electric vehicles in a way that has caused the rest of the industry to do so. And then you might give them 100, so a wide variety of different strategies that end up confusing people. And so what happens actually is investors generally are now buying the underlying data and deciding their own ratings. Just to spend a minute on the reporting metrics, impact metrics, right, to understand the difference here. So reporting metrics would be something like, do you have a diversity, equity, and inclusion policy? How many people have you trained in it? But that doesn't really tell you if you've actually affected the diversity, equity, and inclusion in your company, right? Does that mean that your salary levels are all, the same for, the appropriate job descriptions? Or do you need to have diversity and pay equity metrics that say, actually, this is we have 45% of women are being paid an equitable salary, right, against the men. And I already talked a bit about, on the E side, the sort of difference between a process-oriented metric and a performance-oriented metric. And this is important for companies, not only for investors. As my advice to corporates is, start first with understanding your material ESG issues, then design an embedded sustainability strategy that tackles both the risks and the opportunities. To design your own key performance indicators that are performance-based, and then map them to the reporting metrics, and report against those metrics that make sense for you to report against. We can talk more about that later. Okay, now I'm going to go into the sort of how sustainability is driving better financial returns. Many people, as we discussed, are still questioning the business case. And the question really is why, right? Because when we look at some of these correlation studies and so on, why aren't we more clear that there actually is a business case here? Because I'm sure you've heard this over and over again. People really seem to be concerned that they can't, that the investments can't be justified. So why is this? Well, first of all, assessing the return on sustainability investment can be complicated to implement, right? You have different sustainability strategies in a company, and the strategy and the execution often sits within different units, right? So some part of your strategy might be executed by procurement, part of it might be executed by marketing, part of it might be executed in finance. The financial benefits are tracked differently by the different units, if at all, and they are generally not aggregated and rolled back up into the looking at the impact of the sustainability strategy. Some of the benefits are intangible, things like avoided risk and difficult to measure. It's not clear currently to the finance function that there's a significant financial benefit that would justify tracking ROSI. What's interesting about the finance function, though, is increasingly we're seeing that the CFO needs to sign off on ESG metrics. Prior, it's been sort of in the sustainability office. And as the finance function is needing to sign off on this, they're beginning to get more involved in the collection of ESG data. And as they get involved in that, I believe they're going to start getting more involved in understanding the connection between the ESG metrics and the financial metrics. And then finally, investors and board members currently are not asking for the return on sustainability investment. They are asking for financial metrics, of course, and in some cases for ESG metrics, but not how the two connect. But again, that is beginning to change. So how do we go in and measure the return on sustainability? Especially since, as I mentioned, a fair amount of it is intangible, but this is a challenge for all companies today. This study looked at valuation of companies and found, back in the 70s, 83% of a company's value was in its tangible assets, fixed assets, capital assets. And today, 90% of a company's value is in its intangible assets, its intellectual property, its reputation, its people. And sustainability can very much add to those positive intangible assets. We also need to better monetize and understand short-term and long-term. I hear often from companies, well, yes, we agree that there may be a long-term proposition here, but value proposition, but I don't know that there's a short-term one and I need to deliver short-term results. So we will come back to that as well. We also need to do a much better job of valuing sustainability risk. A lot of these risks are relatively new, but they're accelerating in a really significant way. And so oftentimes companies are not making investments because the investments might be sizable, but they're not thinking about the avoided cost further down the road of a significant, for example, climate event. And on the upside, we not only want to monetize the risk, but we want to be able to monetize what are the, for example, employee productivity and retention benefits? What might be the innovation and growth benefits, right? How do we monetize those? So at the Center for Sustainable Business at NYU Stern, we have designed this model called ROSI, Return on Sustainability Investment, that identifies 9 mediating factors that drive better financial performance when a company embeds sustainability in its strategy and its practice. Those 9 mediating factors include improved customer loyalty, better employee relations, more innovation, good media coverage, operational efficiencies, improved risk management, benefits in sales and marketing, and improved supplier and stakeholder relations, all of which can drive greater profitability, higher valuations, lower cost of capital, and ultimately value creation for society as well as shareholders. When you look at these 9 mediating factors, any kind of good management can drive innovation or risk management, right? But what we're seeing is that sustainability is actually that next wave of good quality management, that many sustainability strategies and practices can drive several of these mediating factors and really are very critical to today's managers. So from that broad analysis, that broad framework, then how do we actually implement against it? So first, for a given sector or a given company, we look at what are the material ESG issues and strategies for that sector or company using frameworks such as SASB or Global Reporting Initiative. Then we look at what are the practices that are being put in place or being contemplated. So you can look backward looking or forward looking. What are the practices that are being implemented or contemplated to address the sustainability strategies? Because it's at the practice level that you can actually monetize the returns. Strategy is at too high level. So once we've identified what those practices are, and I'm going to give you some examples of this, we then can define what kinds of benefits. Are there an innovation benefit? Is there an operational efficiency benefit? Is there a risk management benefit? And then find a unit of measurement, because for the intangibles, you need to figure out how to quantify them, and then monetize those. We're working with a variety of different sectors, from agriculture, working with companies like Cargill and Mars, to automotive, working with companies like General Motors, to pharma, working with companies like Pfizer, utilities, apparel companies, private equity firms, banks, etc. So just to give you an example, looking at a couple of sectors, so I thought the apparel industry might be of interest since they're pretty active in your region. So we look at, once having looked at the material ESG issues, identifying the kind of major strategies for the sector include on the top sort of natural resource management related to chemicals, water, energy, and material waste. And then we see as well strategies associated with sustainable raw material sourcing, circularity and innovation, employee and supplier well-being, and sustainable brand marketing and communications. So this in each of these ROSI analyses, we identify the, through interviews, through desk research, through working with apparel companies, what the key strategies are. Then for each strategy, we identify the specific practices that you can put in place across the value chain. So one strategy, as we said, was improving energy management. On the left, you can see the two broad practices. One would be to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Another would be to prioritize lower carbon distribution methods. And then what you do is going to vary in terms of sub-practices across the different parts of the value chain, right? So you could have renewable energy powering your facilities. You could have energy efficiency. You could reduce your air freight, et cetera. And so for one apparel company, get there, Eileen Fisher, which is a women's clothing company, they had made a climate commitment back in 2015 to reduce their emissions. So they began to move away from air freight and put more into shipping and trucking. And actually and this is something, a consistent theme, hadn't tracked the financial returns even on something as basic as that. So we did that analysis for them and found that in 2019, they spent 1.6 million less in transportation costs than 2015. Interestingly, in 2020, we saw their overall transportation costs go up for airfare as well. And we said, are you starting to return to air freight? And they said, no. What happened during the first year of the pandemic is that air freight costs tripled. So they had real cost increases, but actually far less than they would have had they not begun to move away to the extent possible from air freight. And I highlight that just because energy pricing volatility is a huge issue and it's going to get it to be even a bigger issue, so that those companies that are figuring out alternatives from that in the future will have less volatility in their pricing than peers. Looking at another strategy, investing in employee and supplier well-being. We see here down the left, certain set of practices that you can employ, compensation, wages, workforce diversity, employee sustainability training, benefit programs, and then depending on where you are in the value chain, different ways in which you can apply different types of practices. So with another apparel company who designs activewear, very known for their purpose and sustainability focus. And so with them, we wanted to look at what kind of impact that had on their finances in terms of turnover and hiring costs and productivity. And in fact, what we found is that the benefits to them really significantly reduced turnover and increased productivity. We then subtracted some mission-aligned kind of paid time off to go volunteer on environmental causes and so on, for a total net benefit for the company of $34 million, which was about 5% of their payroll. So pretty significant benefit of their sustainability program. Another example would be investing in circularity and innovation. And again, you can see different programs, product take back, packaging solutions, minimizing production waste, reducing product returns, et cetera. And here, working with Eileen Fisher, who has developed what they call a Renew program, where you can return your clothes for a coupon, which then enables you to buy additional product. And then Eileen Fisher upcycles the clothing either into felt and makes it into something else, or they resell it. And here, what they found is they had pretty good margins from the sale of the used product, But also the coupon was highly successful. People bought a lot of additional product, so that was very beneficial. But the most important, and they got significant free media because they were a leader in the space. But the most important benefit for them is they had struggled to reach a younger demographic. And with this program, they started to bring in younger customers for no acquisition cost. So we monetized all that and found a total net benefit of $1.8 million for them, which was pretty significant. Food and agriculture is another sector that we're in the process of developing. Again, a sector important, I know, in the ASEAN region, looking at, again, a more complex set of strategies: water, soil health, climate, chemicals, animal welfare, et cetera, sustainable packaging, nutritional profile of food products. So a lot of different strategies that we're seeing companies in this space implement. And here we looked with Cargill, for example, at the benefit of better soil health management practices, which sequester carbon in soy farmers in the United States, and found that farmers actually saw a benefit of between $94 and $132 per acre as a result of these better soil health management practices. Again, with little recognition by the farmers, because they weren't collecting this information, that in fact they were seeing financial benefits of those practices. Working with a company called McCormick that sells spices from all over the world, vanilla amongst other things, and looked at them at the business case where we looked at sales and marketing benefits, reduction of cost of capital, used due to risky, because they're sourcing from some risky areas, reduced risk in the supply chain, and also increased in earned media. The benefit to this company was about $6 million, expected to increase 50 to 60%. For McCormick, not a huge amount of money, but what's important to understand here is that McCormick and most companies actually thought that sustainable sourcing was costing them money. But when you looked at this broader analysis, you found that not only was it not costing them money, they were making a bit of money on it. Also, another example, working around beef in Brazil, we found that ranchers selling into McDonald's and Carrefour were seeing really significant benefits as a result of the uptake of sustainable agriculture practices, 7 times increase in profitability, increase in productivity, and then those benefits passed on to slaughterhouses and to retailers. I know I'm getting close on time, so I'm going to rush a little through this. In automotive, also found for one company, for example, that their sustainability practices improved earnings by about 3.7% of revenues. So again, to give you an example, improving waste management, a very important strategy. One particular practice is to recycle paint and solvents. When you recycle paint and solvents, you no longer buy the virgin stuff, you no longer have the waste disposal costs, and they were actually selling some leftover recycled product. I want to point out here that finance does not currently track avoided cost. And so when analyses are being done of the ROI around sustainability, avoided cost is not included, but it's a really significant benefit in a whole series of different practices that really needs to be included in the tracking. So what we found, for example, for one company, as a result of their waste management strategy, they had a total annual net EBIT impact of $235 million that they did not know because they were not looking at, for example, all the avoided costs, both in terms of lower spend in virgin materials, but also reduction in water costs by using recycled water, energy savings, reduction in waste disposal costs, and so on. And similarly, when we looked at end-of-life recycling, which is required in Europe, one company was reusing 2.5% of the end-of-life material and selling 10%. They hadn't looked at the financial benefits because they were looking at it as a compliance program, but actually they were netting $100 million as a result of that reuse of product and sale of recycling product. So that is my presentation. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm looking very much forward to questions from you, Sharil, and from the audience.
Thank you, Tonsi. And just before I start, just to clarify, I was informed that the pronunciation is Tonsi. That's right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's correct.
Just in case anybody was playing a prank on me. So that's thank you, Tonsi. Well, that was nothing short of a masterclass. I think everybody would agree. You've covered a lot of things, a lot of new things for some of us here, and it had actually answered quite a few of my questions. But I do have a few other questions. In Maybank, we tend to be better prepared, right? First question I want to ask you, and this is because you being on the other part of the world, literally 12 hours away, yeah? And I did ask you earlier, are you familiar with this part of the world? You have been to Indonesia, probably not to all the 10 ASEAN countries, in which this session is called Invest ASEAN, where the standards of living and where economic development is very varied, right? So one question I like to ask, and it often is the elephant in the room when we talk about things like climate change, right? So we know that humans have emitted a large amount, 450 billion metric tons of carbon since the Industrial Revolution, and this is now contributing to the current climate crisis. And we've spoken a lot about how the Western world has emitted most of the carbon then, and that today, the developing world, and our part of the world, we are being asked to cut back on emissions in pursuit of development. So the impact on social aspects can be especially more pronounced. Well, we see that in our part of the world, especially for those who are on the low income. So, you know, Tonsi, and you would agree, developing countries have our own economic needs too. So we cannot be expected to stop developing in order to save the world or the developing world. So how should this seemingly unfair ask of the low-income economies be tackled?
Yeah, well, so first of all, I would agree that the countries that have created the problem need to support and take responsibility for that and provide more financing and technical support than they are currently doing to support those countries that are being negatively affected and have not themselves been responsible for these emissions. So I think that's a really important part of what we need to do at a global level. That said, I would say that copying what we did, which ended up being stupid, it's not a recipe for success for anybody. It's certainly not a recipe for success for us. And really what we need to do is innovate around decoupling economic development from natural resource use and waste generation. And those countries and companies that innovate around decoupling that economic development are the ones that are going to win, are going to create great opportunities for their citizens, because while climate change, absolutely, we bear the responsibility for a big part of it, the impacts will be felt by everyone. And so building resiliency, ensuring that we actually don't go beyond the 1.5 degrees that we're already locked into, requires everyone, but also creates business opportunity. I mean, if you look at China, China's investment in solar is huge, and they are leading the world in that industry, right? So we you know, why wouldn't different countries sort of invest in new industries or finding, designing and supporting industries that are going to solve for these problems, which will create competitive advantage for those businesses and for those companies. And so I think really as we look about, if we look out, this next stage of innovation for corporates is really around solving for these challenges and creating new technologies and new solutions and services and products that will tackle them and provide good jobs, provide a good quality of life for people in ASEAN countries. So that would be, you know, it's a challenging question, of course, but that would be my advice.
Thank you for that balanced view, Tonsi. Let's go back to ROSI itself. Very interesting. And I think that ROSI looks extremely persuasive, very compelling, but the reality on the ground may be different, right? So there's that need for us to balance between ROI and other business needs. So based on your experience, what distinction do you recognize in companies who've successfully implemented this framework or have successfully measured their ROSI? Is it in their talents or leadership or the capacity they build? What would you say?
I think it's the recognition that ESG issues are in their sector are material for them and need to become part of their business strategy. So it isn't a corporate social responsibility kind of program off to the side. It actually is insight into how they do business to become more excellent in terms of improving operational excellence. So as I showed examples, if we tend to think of pollution and waste as just a compliance issue, but actually it's the ultimate in operational inefficiency. You're buying more than you need to pay to dispose of what's left over, right? I'll give you an example of a company, a pulp and paper company that was getting free water. And so when the chief sustainability officer said, we need to reduce the amount of water because this isn't good, it wasn't in a water risk area, but anyway, the plant managers all said, why? We don't pay for it. So he did the analysis and found out that actually all that free water it was an enormous amount of water. So the energy to move it around was really extensive. To heat and cool it was very extensive. And then they had a lot of wastewater to process to the tune of $1.5 million per year per mill, right? But they were thinking of it as free water. But that free water was costing them. So those companies that put in place the strategies to understand and delve deeper into how sustainability can help you drive new products and services, new innovations, new revenues, reduce costs, avoid risk, create also, as I showed, more, we have a war for talent happening right now. People, younger generation, want to work for companies that are doing good, right? So if you want to be able to hire the best and the brightest, this is also really core to your future. So there's a whole series of benefits to companies around really authentically engaging around sustainability. And I see that I see that at the leadership level, right? You need that executive leadership behind it. But then you see a lot of the younger employees really pushing for it or walking away if they're concerned about problematic behavior by the company.
And related to that, the ability to monetize that in a way that you're able to make it even more compelling. Yeah. So I would guess on its own, tracking ROSI is challenging because at this point in time, at least, not many know how to measure this component, and also because it may be considered a cost to measure it, right? So based on your experience also, how can internal ESG teams or even the leadership persuade its finance function to track it and that it will return significant financial benefit in doing so? How do you balance it? What kind of metrics would you use?
So I think increasingly the finance function is recognizing that this is something they need to pay attention to. But I agree with you. Finance tends to be the last one to the table, which is unfortunate because they're critical to making these decisions. But more and more, I am meeting CFOs who are embracing this and taking on. But so how do we engage them? So first is, I think sustainability folks don't necessarily speak the language of finance. So they're talking in greenhouse gas emission numbers, not in energy savings numbers, right? So the first step is to really understand how might you translate your sustainability targets into financial benefits, and ask finance department, the finance function, to help you design the metrics to actually track those returns. In terms of how much does it cost to put in place the ability to track the financial returns? If you're completely redoing your accounting system, of course, that's going to be very expensive, but you could identify something, a couple of sort of basic metrics like energy savings, operational efficiencies are not that challenging to track, and put some of those kind of low-hanging fruit in place. And then over time, working with finance, continue to bring them in. It's fascinating. I mean, I'm seeing the transformation of finance function. I was talking to a big cheese company who's out of France, who's now their finance people are actually all trained in purpose and ESG, and they're making it a big part of their work to focus in on these issues.
Okay. just a couple more questions. One is related to disclosures. You spoke about disclosures as well. You spoke about ISB. You spoke about many of these new developments. One of the challenges in implementing ESG and in partnering clients on the sustainability journey would be those in the SME sector, small medium enterprises, right? So what can corporates in the ASEAN region learn from the counterparts in the US and the EU on ESG disclosures and practices? The surveys say there's a lot of cost involved there. And how would this be compelling for the mid-sized companies, to do good? I like to say that to be in the green, you cannot be in the red, right? So how do we work with these companies, the SMEs?
Yeah, so I agree. I mean, so I agree that I think a lot of as I mentioned before, the reporting metrics are process-based. And so not all that useful for improving performance and management of a company. They're a necessary evil because you need to have some coherence around what people are reporting on or what companies are reporting on. And for small, medium-sized businesses, often they're B2B and selling into companies that need to be demonstrating against, progress against their commitments. So they need their suppliers to then provide that data. However, the way I would approach it is not to start with, I need to report to these gazillion standards and metrics, but okay, I'm this company in this sector. These are the material ESG issues for me. I'm going to focus on these three, that are whatever the number is, that are the most important in terms of both their materiality and the opportunity for me. And then I am going to develop my own key performance indicators for that to ensure that I'm meeting my own targets from a management perspective. And then I'm going to map those against the reporting metrics that I'm asked to report against. And I'm going to explain why I don't report to everything, because the rest of that stuff is not material to my business strategy, right? And I think when you do that, you're, as long as you're not greenwashing, as long as you're not picking something that is like really easy and nothing to do with, what's material for your company, then I think, nobody will accept that. But if you're got a robust strategy, I think that your clients will understand and be supportive of that.
Okay, Tansi, I want to go back to Tesla. You mentioned Tesla earlier, right? So, upon being dropped from the S&P 500 ESG index, Elon Musk called the ESG ratings a scam, right? What's your thoughts on this? Actually, a bit more detail on this, and how can investors take a more meaningful approach to the ESG investment deliberation? Because these kind of things they do impact people's thinking, right? In the approach.
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons why I sort of showed what was happening with Tesla in there. So, I mean, really, it comes down to there's a lot of weaknesses in the ESG data, which is fair. So the attacks on the kind of ESG data system are somewhat fair. It doesn't mean, though, that there shouldn't be any. It's just that we're at the beginning in a kind of wild west and of this process. And there's a lot of weaknesses that need to be worked through in terms of both the ESG data itself, the type of problems I talked about earlier, and how the ESG rating agencies tackle this. For Tesla specifically, there are some significant negative governance and social issues at that company that if you are rating overall, so, you're looking at the total ESG score, you might say, I would drop this company, right? Then, as I mentioned earlier, on the environmental side, there's different ways you can approach it, right? I personally, what I think was the most jarring is to see that ExxonMobil stayed in the S&P index and Tesla was dropped. Versus, are there some real challenges with ESG with Tesla, which there are, right? But ExxonMobil. So, this again goes back to that challenge around the ESG data and the rating systems. That does not mean, however, that managing for your material ESG issues as part of your business strategy is an absolutely imperative. And it does not mean that you cannot create financial value through it. And it does not mean that the ESG investing movement isn't going to figure this stuff out. It will, because it's imperative because of what's happening in terms of issues like climate change that we have to tackle.
Well, okay, before I pass over to Seng Yao and ask if there's any questions from the floor, from the audience, I'm just going to ask one more question. And this is of interest, at least to me, because at Maybank, as with many other financial institutions, we do face questions, queries from investor activists, from NGOs, and so on. Now, Tonsi was, for a while, president of the Rainforest Alliance, right?
Yes.
Talk to us about that. What was your experience with deforestation issues? How did you deal with developing countries? How did you deal with financial institutions? How best to address this concern, particularly for us, like, for example, in this part of the world, where with developing nations with large forest cover, right?
Well, so Rainforest Alliance focus was really on providing sustainable livelihoods and conserving biodiversity through market-based solutions. So our goal was to support sustainable forest management as an important job creator, and also a way to protect the forests, right? Because sometimes if you don't have forest management, you might then have slash and burn agriculture or conversion to commodity crops. So in our approach, we believed that ensuring, one, sustainable forest management, two, markets that rewarded sustainable forest management, and three, ideally ecosystem service payments, which is really, not where it needs to be, but we're seeing the beginnings of more payments for the protection of biodiversity and sequestration of carbon in forested areas. So I do think that there is a more and more focus on how do you support people who live off of natural resources, how do you enable them to ensure sustainable livelihoods, but do it in a way that actually it's not good for them to have problematic forest practices either, right? Because that destroys their livelihoods ultimately. So you need to really find that balance.
Okay, thank you, Tonsi. Seng Yao, over to you. Are there any questions for Tonsi from the audience?
Okay, all right. Thank you, Shariel, Tonsi, for that great session. Well, now the next session will be championing DEI, a conversation that is brought to you by the 30% Club of Malaysia. This is a two-part session, with the first session held by Dr. Amy Morris, Chief Executive Officer of Maybank Investment Banking Group, where she goes into an exclusive one-to-one interview with Peter Grove, Bloomberg's chairman and founding chair of the US chapter of the 30% Club, on raising the DEI agenda in ASEAN. This is then followed by a second half with Dr. Amy moderating an esteemed panel of speakers to talk about a connection between DEI and sustainable businesses. We will end this webinar now, so please join us in the next session. Thank you.